the shadow of the Sormovo freak. Picture this: a cold, grimy workshop at the Krasnoye Sormovo plant, designated as Factory Number 112 in the city of Gorky. The year is 1943. There's a world war raging outside. Rolling off the assembly lines are the famous T-34s, the legendary machines that were the scourge of German tigers and panthers. But inside these walls, these tanks have a dark nickname: the Sormovo Freaks. Why? Not because of how they looked, but because of an invisible enemy hidden within their very armor. The cast turrets, which were supposed to withstand direct shell hits, were developing cracks. Not just surface scratches, but sinister, winding fissures in the steel that drastically reduced a crew's chance of survival in a firefight. The bitter irony: this was the very same factory that had built the very first Soviet tank back in 1920. Now, it was producing machines with a fatal flaw. This wasn't just a manufacturing defect. It was a form of unintentional sabotage, and the best minds from the Central Scientific Research Institute 48 were called in to solve it. Their report, now sitting in a Russian state archive, isn't a dry list of facts. It's a suspense story spanning months of painstaking work. It's the story of a fight for the quality of every single turret, for the life of every single crewman. A drama in metal. The mystery of the cracks. Let's ditch the technical jargon and imagine a T-34 turret. It's not just a hunk of steel. It's a complex casting, like a steel flower where the petals are the armor plates, and the core is a ring-shaped base that holds everything together. It was on this ring that the fatal flaw appeared. After being machined on a lathe, the surface would reveal these cracks like ominous warnings. What were they like? Size: up to 30 or 35 millimeters long, sometimes even 60. Not huge, but deep enough to sometimes go right through the armor. Shape: not straight lines, but zigzagging like lightning bolts frozen in the metal. They often spread out radially, like rays from an invisible center. The twist: the main paradox. These cracks were considered reparable. They were gouged out and welded shut. But imagine a wartime assembly line. Every repair meant hours of downtime, precious materials, and workers who could be building a new turret instead of fixing a flawed one. There were other, larger quench cracks that couldn't be fixed, but those were rarer. It was these small, reparable ones that were the real plague on production. They were the prime target for the investigation team of engineers: Kaptia, Khmelaevsky, Alkova, and their leader, Fedosienko. My take: what strikes me as a non-expert is their method. They weren't looking for someone to blame. They were conducting an investigation, like sheriffs in a Western tracking down an elusive outlaw. Their weapons weren't six-shooters, but thermocouples, files, and the Brunel test. Their dialogue wasn't a gunfight, but a debate over carbon and chromium content. And the outcome of that debate determined whether men lived or died. A steel detective's glossary. Key terms you need. To make sure we're all on the same page, let's decode the secret language of these steel sleuths. Tempering. High-temperature tempering. This isn't a vacation. It's a complex heat treatment. Imagine taking a newly cast turret, full of internal stress, like a compressed spring, and slowly heating it to between 500 and 680 degrees Celsius, then holding it there. The goal is to relieve that stress, to calm the metal, make it less brittle and more tough, able to take a hit. It's like sending an overstressed, nervous soldier to a spa before a big battle. Feeder head, or riser in casting, this isn't about profit. It's a technological reserve. It's an extra lump of metal on the top or side of a casting that serves one purpose: to feed liquid metal to the main part as it shrinks while cooling. Later, this feeder head is brutally cut off. It's the umbilical cord connecting the turret to the casting system. Brunel hardness test. A way to measure how hard a metal is. A hard ball is pressed into it, and the size of the dent is measured. A smaller dent means harder steel. It's like testing the firmness of a mattress by pressing your hand into it. Segregation, liquation, the most insidious phenomenon. When steel cools and crystallizes, the chemical elements inside it don't spread out evenly. The more refractory ones cluster in some places, the more fusible in others. Imagine a fruit jelly setting. with all the fruit chunks clumping together. In metal, this creates zones with different strength and chemistry. It's the casting's congenital disease, the economic battlefield, the cost of victory. Factory number 112 in Gorky was a flagship of Soviet tank production. By the end of 1943, it was churning out over 250 T-34 tanks per month. Now imagine, one out of every 5 turrets needs crack repairs. That's dozens, if not hundreds, of turrets every single month. A one-day delay meant several tanks not reaching the front. The cost of oxygen for cutting, electricity for furnaces, and the labor of welders. All this was a heavy burden on the already strained wartime economy. Fighting cracks was both a technological and a critical economic mission. The battlefield, the heat treatment shop. First clues. So, where did the investigators start? They laid out several key hypotheses to test on the factory floor. The war wouldn't wait, so they worked fast but thoroughly. Does high-temperature tempering before cutting off the feeder heads affect crack formation? Hypothesis 1. Does the turret's hardness affect its tendency to crack? Hypothesis 2. Is it crucial to send the turret for tempering immediately after cutting off the feeder heads? Hypothesis 3. Do cracks appear after the final quench, or are we just seeing old ones we missed? Hypothesis 4. Does the thickness of the turret's wall influence its tendency to crack? Hypothesis 5. The plan was ambitious. Track 4 to 6 different melt batches, with at least 4 turrets cast from each. But reality, as usual, had other ideas. In the end, the researchers kept a close watch on 29 turrets made from steel grade 8S and 58 made from steel 44L. That's a colossal amount of data to process by hand in 1943. A modern perspective, today we'd feed all this into an AI that would find all the correlations in seconds. Back then, every parameter, temperature, time, chemical composition, was written down by hand in paper logbooks. The work of Kaptiug and his team was the equivalent of a big data analysis, performed with slide rules and gut instinct. The torch and the fatal stress. A major clue was the location of the cracks. The vast majority were found directly underneath where the feeder heads had been attached. This was a breakthrough. The process of cutting off these feeder heads wasn't delicate jewelry work. It was oxy-fuel cutting, a torch. A powerful jet of oxygen and fuel gas burned through the massive steel tail. This caused the metal in the cutting zone to heat up instantly and intensely, then cool just as rapidly. This created monstrous localized stress. This stress piled on top of the internal stress already in the turret from casting, which hadn't been fully relieved by tempering. But why did the cracks appear specifically under the feeder heads? The answer is segregation. In these massive, slow-cooling parts, the segregation process was most intense. The metal here was non-uniform, sick, with lower strength. It was the weak link, and when the stress from the torch hit it, it gave way. It cracked. My reflection, this is like a person with a hidden illness. They might look healthy, but a major stressor, like the cutting torch, reveals their weak spot. The turret was sick in its seemingly strongest points, the very places that had given it life during birth. There's a deep symbolism there. What gave it life became its point of vulnerability. Chemistry as destiny. The search for the perfect recipe. One of the most fascinating parts of the investigation was the chemical analysis. The engineers pieced together data, element by element, to find the guilty parties. They grouped all the melts of 44L steel by their tendency to crack. A picture began to emerge. Good melts, no cracks carbon, 0.22 to 0.25%, manganese, 0.9 to 1.06%, chromium, 1.22 to 1.40%. Bad melts with cracks carbon, 0.25 to 0.28%, manganese, 1.05 to 1.10%, chromium, 1.30 to 1.40%. The conclusion was clear. To minimize cracks, they needed to stick to the lower limits for carbon and manganese. But this created another problem. Chromium was essential for achieving a fibrous fracture, a key indicator of quality armor. If chromium was too low, less than 1.3%. The armor could behave in a brutal way when hit by a shell. It was a delicate balancing act. The metallurgists had to walk a tightrope, enough chromium for strength, but not so much as to invite cracks. The optimal range for chromium was determined to be 1.3 to 1.6%. The resource war. Here's the real kicker. The 8S steel required nickel and ferromolybdenum in its recipe. These were strategic, scarce materials worth their weight in gold. The 44L steel did without them. This represented a colossal saving for a nation fighting a total war. That's why it was so vital to tame the temperamental 44L, to find a way to make it work, to save both the lives of tank crews and the strategic resources of the state. A brilliant fix, lighten the turret. One of the most elegant and effective solutions proposed and tested by the team was to reduce the turret's weight. Initially, the machining allowance on the inner surface of the ring was a whopping 50 millimeters. This created a monstrously massive structure, 120 millimeters thick in the feeder head zones. The engineers proposed a revolutionary idea: make the allowance uniform and reduce it to just 15 millimeters. The wall thickness dropped to 80 millimeters. The result? It was a game changer. The overall number of turrets with cracks dropped from 68% to 38%. The number of cracks found after the final quench fell from 55% to 35%. Why did it work? Less segregation. A less massive casting cooled faster and more evenly, weakening the segregation process. The metal became more uniform and stronger. Less cutting stress. Thinner feeder heads were easier and faster to cut, reducing the heat-affected zone and its associated stresses. Healthier metal. Less material was machined away, meaning the more external, healthy layers of metal were exposed, not the internal, segregation-weakened ones. This solution is brilliant in its simplicity. They didn't add expensive alloys or complicate the process. They simplified it. They removed the excess. This embodies a great engineering principle: efficiency and simplicity under conditions of extreme scarcity. They weren't adding muscle. They were trimming the fat, making the turret not weaker, but more rational. The fateful conclusions and bold proposals. The result of months of work was a detailed list of conclusions and proposals. It was a true roadmap to salvaging the reputation of the Sormovo tanks. Cracks are a complex problem. Innate metal weakness under feeder heads plus stress from casting, cutting, and quenching. The brittleness that leads to cracks is not related to hardness. It's a question of internal stress. 8S steel is generally less prone to cracking than 44L, especially after the quench. For 44L, the preliminary tempering before cutting feeder heads can be skipped, unlike for 8S, saving huge amounts of time and fuel. The quench water temperature for 8S must not be below 30 degrees Celsius. Bold proposals for the future. Check if the small cracks are even that dangerous. The engineers stayed outright. The size and location of these cracks makes us doubt they are a critical danger to the turret's survival. They proposed live-fire tests. If the cracks weren't critical, they should stop welding them. This would free up entire workshops for productive work. Revise the standards for phosphorus. The existing limit of 0.030% was called unjustified. Their data showed no negative effect even at 0.039%. This would allow for the use of cheaper raw materials. Fully switch to the lighter weight turret design. It wasn't just metal, it was people. The story of the cracked turrets at factory number 112 isn't a story of failure. It's a story of triumph. The triumph of a systematic approach, scientific thought, and engineering courage over the chaos of wartime. The people in the dusty workshops, the engineers with their blueprints and thermocouples, the lab assistants logging data, they weren't just building tanks. They were solving a puzzle posed by the very nature of materials. They were finding compromises between strength and manufacturability, between quality and speed, between the ideal and the grim reality of 1943. The Sormovo freak ceased to be a freak. Thanks to this work, The tanks rolling out of the factory gates in late 1943 and then in 1944 were different. More reliable, more survivable. They weren't just forging steel, they were forging victory. And in every turret that left without a fatal crack, there was a piece of their intellect, their labor, and their profound sense of responsibility. So that's the story. A story I try to bring to life for you all. I hope you found this technical detective story as gripping as I did. It really makes you think, how many more of these untold stories from the home front are sitting in archives? How many engineering geniuses have been forgotten? If you want me to keep finding and animating stories like this, that subscribe button and a like are absolutely essential. It's the best reward for me and the signal to keep going. Now, I want to hear from you in the comments. What shocked you the most? The brutal working conditions? The cleverness of the solutions? Or maybe you've worked in manufacturing or metallurgy and seen something similar. Share your thoughts. Let's discuss this amazing piece of history together.